Alrighty, well, thanks for sticking around to the bitter end here for those of you who remain. We certainly don't have a light topic to finish our day as we delve into the Iranian issue, which has only become a more pressing topic with the recent signing of the nuclear framework agreement. And so we have three experts here to help us shed some light on this and answer questions on this important topic. So we're going to begin with remarks from Gareth Porter. Gareth Porter is an investigative journalist and historian. He specializes in U.S. foreign and military policy. He's the author of 5 books, the most recent being Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare. He will be signing that book after this panel, if you want to stick around for that. In 2012, he won the Martha Gellhorn Prize for Investigative Journalism by the UK-based Gellhorn Trust. He will discuss the push for war on Iran.
Thanks very much to the organizers of this event, which, this is the second such event that I've participated in, and I'm really happy to see the great audience for the event and wish the organizers all the best in continuing this tradition, as other speakers have suggested. Now, I know that Reza Marashi is going to be focusing more laser-like on the recent accord and what he expects to happen in the near future on this. But I do feel that I need to introduce what I have to say about the push for war in Iran with a few remarks, at least, about the recent developments regarding the negotiations in Lausanne, because it does directly link to a key part of what I have to talk about, which is the role that Israel has played in the threat of war between the United States and Iran. The recent understanding, interim tentative agreement reached in Lausanne, as I think all of you know by now, has suddenly been shown to be vulnerable to differences that were picked apart, if you will, as a result of things that happened immediately after the initial agreement. That is to say, initially after the joint statement by the P5+1, represented by Ms. Mogherini of the EU on one side and Foreign Minister Zarif on the Iranian side. Almost immediately, it became clear that there were some other voices that were not prepared to simply allow that joint statement to stand, including specifically the U.S. State Department, which issued its own text interpreting the tentative agreement, which departed specifically from the agreed joint statement with regard to the question of lifting sanctions. And that issue of lifting sanctions, I don't want to go into the details about this. I'm going to leave that to Reza to the extent that he is going to dissect that problem. But specifically, the question of lifting sanctions is linked to the role of Israel through specifically the problem of possible military dimensions. I put that in quotation marks. The famous PMD issue, which was one of the issues that Iran pledged within this tentative agreement to implement in terms of carrying out the totality of the agreement. The Iranians agreed to implement a whole series of steps, one of which, all the other steps had to do with either the transparency of their nuclear program or specific steps to constrain their nuclear program. But there's one issue which departed from that set, and that was the possible military dimensions of the Iranian program. PMD, possible military dimensions, refers to allegations that have been made over the years by the International Atomic Energy Agency, as well as Western governments, that Iran, in fact, did carry out nuclear weapons work, particularly between 2001 and 2003, but there are other allegations that extend at least potentially beyond 2003. Now, the linkage here with the possible military dimensions is that the Iranians agree, supposedly under this framework, to explain or to give adequate access to the IAEA that the IAEA needs to be able to understand the issues that have to do with the allegations that have to do with these supposed Iranian nuclear weapons activities. And what I need to do at this point is to explain how this issue of possible military dimensions is in fact not a genuine issue, but an issue that was created, or as I put it in the title of my book, manufactured, part of a manufactured crisis that has been with us now for a decade, or a little bit more than a decade, which revolves around the notion that Iran has been deceiving the rest of the world for many years, that it has had covertly a nuclear weapons program, and that it has always coveted nuclear weapons. My book, Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare, lays out the real history of this issue of the Iran nuclear program and shows that there has been essentially a false narrative created layer upon layer over the years that goes back to the Clinton administration, certainly, and then was developed obviously much more effectively, much more far-reaching way by the Bush administration, handed over to the Obama administration, which has continued to take the position that that, in fact, represents the true history of the Iranian nuclear issue. And I don't have the time to go over that history except insofar as it relates to the specific problem of the role that Israel played in creating that manufactured crisis. And to try to summarize this in just a couple of minutes, what actually happened here was that in 2001, when the George W. Bush administration came into office, it had in its national security team a group of neoconservatives who were quite determined to carry out a strategy in the Middle East that involved regime change, very far-reaching strategy of regime change, which essentially would remove all of the regimes in the Middle East who were not client states of the United States and Israel, on the same side as the United States and Israel. And of course, we all know what the consequences of that strategy were with regard to Iraq. The neoconservatives, working through and with the full cooperation and support of the Vice President's office, Vice President Dick Cheney's office, put together what amounted to a false intelligence dossier that did show supposedly that Iraq had programs of weapons of mass destruction. And that was the political lever that was used to push this country into a mood to support the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, the same individuals in the Bush administration were planning to do the same thing with regard to Iran. Iran was on the list of 5 regimes which was to be changed through the use of military force if necessary. And they did believe, according to Hillary Mantel Everett, who was on the National Security Council staff from 2001 to 2002, and talked to some of the people who were part of this neoconservative coterie. They, in fact, expected that the United States would have to use force in Iran. This plan, this Iranian part of the plan was not to be carried out immediately. They had to consolidate control over Iraq militarily, and then they could move on using the military facilities that they would control in Iraq to put pressure on, to intimidate, and if necessary, to actually to project military force into the rest of the region, including specifically Iran. As we all know, that didn't happen. To a great extent, it was because the resistance to the US invasion of Iraq was far stronger than the neoconservatives ever dreamed. And as a result of that, they did not have the opportunity really to push on to Iran. There was an effort made in 2007 by the Vice President's office, by Cheney himself, to propose a bombing of targets in Iran in case they could find an excuse in Iraq. But the Pentagon squashed that very quickly, relatively easily, according to what I understand, what I've read and been told. So that was really the end of that threat, at least at that period of the history of this issue. And the role that Israel played in this plan that the neoconservatives had was to come up with the intelligence evidence that would be used against Iran. This happened in 2004 when a set of documents mysteriously materialized and found its way into the hands of Western intelligence. And we now know that it was the German intelligence agency which obtained the documents from, at that time, unknown source, and then turned them over to the CIA, which then ultimately, through the Bush administration, these were turned over to the International Atomic Energy Agency and became the centerpiece of the political campaign, an extremely successful political campaign that has been waged ever since 2008, up to the present time, to convince the entire world that, in fact, that Iran stood accused with credible evidence of having had a secret nuclear weapons program, therefore cannot be trusted and must be subjected to an extraordinary set of arrangements which would go 15, 20 years with a set of constraints which no other state has ever been asked to accept. So just a few words then about these documents, because this is absolutely crucial to understanding this whole issue of possible military dimensions, and therefore to understanding, I would argue, the fate of this accord which was reached in Lausanne, because it is indeed the possible military dimensions issue which constitutes the biggest threat to reaching an accord. This is the part of the agreement that, that clearly would take the longest number of years, the longest period of time, and which Iran clearly is afraid would be used by the United States and its Western allies to actually prevent Iran from being able to have the relief from the sanctions that are the primary interest that they have in these negotiations. So that's why this is so important. Now, what role did the Israelis play? In my book, I make the case that these documents were fabricated by the Mossad, International Intelligence Service of Israel, and that the documents were then passed on to the Mujahideen Khalq, the exiled Iranian terrorist organization. It's now gotten off the list. It's been given a pass, a get-out-of-jail-free card, by the State Department under the Obama administration. But at that time, it was understood to be a terrorist organization both in the United States and in European countries. And more importantly, it was known, and it's well documented, to have been a client organization of Israel's Mossad, having served the purpose of laundering intelligence or alleged intelligence, purported intelligence, that the Israelis did not want to have attributed to the Israeli government, to Mossad. There are more than one examples of this that are now well documented, and even documented in a popular book published in Israel in Hebrew by a strong supporter of Mossad. It's a popular history of Mossad's biggest successful covert operations, one of which he argues, asserts, and says he has the evidence to support it, was these documents, which were passed on to the IAEA ultimately through this chain, but which he says the Mujahideen calc got from Mossad. He doesn't claim that all the documents came from Mossad, but he does claim that some of those documents definitely came from Mossad. So that is the sort of the chain of custody that I reconstruct in my book. The evidence that the documents came from Israel there's no smoking gun in the person of a former Mossad whistleblower that I can point to, but I can point to, and I do quote, the former German Foreign Office official, senior Foreign Office official, who gave me an interview on the record saying that he knew for a fact, because he was told by senior officials of the German intelligence service, that those documents did come from Mujahideen calc. They did not come from some former Iranian engineer or scientist who was part of this supposed Iranian covert nuclear weapons program. So that was the story that had been passed on to the news media, as well as to the IAEA by Bush administration officials. So that's the first piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence is that these documents were just part of a series of handovers of documents by the Israelis to the IAEA. There was a second series of documents that were given by the Israelis to the IAEA beginning in 2008 and continuing through 2009. We know this because former IAEA Director General Mohammed al-Baradei specifically states this in his book based on his own knowledge of what was going on when he was there in 2008 and 2009 before he retired from the agency. And the very interesting fact is that despite Mohammed al-Baradei's telling all of us this through his memoirs, no mainstream news source has ever reported that any of these documents, which were later featured by the IAEA in a report in November 2011, came from Israel. This fact has always been covered up by the news media. I'm the only journalist who's ever reported, and every time I write about these documents, I always point out the evidence that they came from Israel, including al-Baradei's own experience in his memoirs. But the IAEA itself has never acknowledged that the documents came from the Israelis in its reports. This has never been mentioned. It's never been mentioned in the news media. The argument has always been that these documents were, had to be, the source of the documents had to be kept secret because it would reveal sources and methods. This is the usual intelligence speak for not providing any information about where where the source originated, what the original source was. But of course, this doesn't apply at the national level. This is an entirely different level, and the rule obviously should be different, because the world's public has a right to know, in making their own judgment about the credibility of these documents, where they originated. What was the source? If they came from Israel, as El-Baradei said they did, then clearly these documents reflect the national interest of the Israelis, and they should be scrutinized with extraordinary care rather than being assumed to be authentic. So that's the second point. The other point that I want to make about authenticity is that the IAEA, during the El-Baradei regime, when he was Director General, did not believe that those documents were authentic. They believed that they were fabricated. I know that for a fact from a former IAEA, a senior IAEA official who, off the record, was not willing to be quoted, told me that that they understood that these documents not only had not been authenticated, but they were probably not authentic for a variety of reasons. Clearly he distrusted those documents, and he acknowledged that El-Baradei felt the same way. Then there's a final point that I want to make, and that is that for all kinds of reasons, it's clear that this second series of documents, there are linkages between what is claimed in these documents and information that we can definitely attribute to the Israeli government. For one thing, the Israeli government leaked to Israeli journalists in 2009 that they, in 2011, excuse me, that they in fact had provided most of the important documents that the IAEA was using to indict Iran. And then the final thing the point I want to make is that, that if you go back to 2004, there is a very important set of, 2003, 2004, there's a very important set of trips that John Bolton, who was the Bush administration's point man, both on weapons of mass destruction as well as on Iran and on Israel, made a series of trips to Israel, at least some of which were not authorized. I believe none of them were authorized by the Regional Bureau of the State Department, which is absolutely firm practice, a rule of the State Department, that a senior official wanting to visit a country must get the approval of the Regional Bureau to visit that country. That approval was never given by the Bureau on the Middle East, on Near East and South Asia in the State Department. And during some of those visits, we know, from testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Bolton was being nominated to be the ambassador to the United Nations, that he met secretly with the head of Mossad. Now, one of those trips was in June of 2003, and a few weeks later, within a matter of weeks, we know from journalists who have no axe to grind on this, and they're certainly not anti-Israeli, they are far more supportive of Israel than the usual journalist. We know that Mossad set up a new office that summer, 2003, the explicit purpose of which was to influence the opinions of the world's press and governments about the Iranian nuclear program. And it was during the period from the summer of 2003 to early to mid-2004 when these documents were clearly being fabricated. Now, I'm running out of time, but I just want to add that I also in my book have an analysis showing how these documents could not possibly be authentic, because key points in the documents, particularly the drawings of the Shahab-3 Iranian missile, which is supposedly shown as efforts to integrate a nuclear weapon into the missile, into the nose cone of the missile. the drawings show the wrong missile. It shows the earlier version of that missile, which the Iranians had already abandoned in the year 2000 and had begun to redesign it, which was known. It was known that the Iranians were redesigning the missile. What was not known was that the nose cone of that missile, the reentry vehicle, would look completely different. And it was only in July, August 2004 that foreign intelligence agencies for the first time knew that the nose cone did not resemble the original one. So these documents were fabricated by someone who was not in the Iranian government, who was not aware of what their plan was for their development of a missile, redesign of the missile. It was fabricated by a foreign entity that did not know what was going on until it was too late, until those documents were on their way to the Mujahideen calc, and thus through this chain to the IAEA. Just in conclusion, what I want to impress upon you is the importance of these fabricated documents and the role of Israel in the current problem of negotiating with the Iranians a deal that will hold, because it is these documents that constitute the most difficult part of that deal, a part that the Obama administration continues to say we are going to insist that the Iranians must explain, must give an account of these documents that is acceptable to the IAEA. And the Iranians obviously have been arguing from the beginning, well, you know, these are fabricated documents. What do you expect us to say? What do you expect us to do? And they're going to give access. I've been told by an Iranian source that they will give the access that the IAEA asks for, but that they're not going to be held accountable for explaining these in a way that corresponds to the position of the Western governments or to the position that the IAEA has taken in the past. And that is a potential crisis within the negotiations, which we still don't know exactly how it's going to play out. And I hope that it will, in fact, be resolved, but I think that it is the most dangerous part of the situation at this point. Thank you very much.
And so with that history in mind, we now advance to the current happenings with Iran and the nuclear deal. And for that, we turn to Reza Marashi, who is the research director from NIAC, the National Iranian American Council. Before joining NIAC 4 years ago, he was with the State Department's Office of Iranian Affairs. He's a commentator all over the place these days. If you have a TV, you've probably seen him. He's logged many hours over in Europe covering the talks, and he will give us the latest update on the nuclear talks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. Hopefully talking about Iran at the end of the day is a nice change of pace, because as I looked at the agenda and saw all the interesting stuff you guys were talking about before the Iran panel came up, it looked like it run the gamut. So let's spice things up. Let's talk about Iran a little bit, which in theory is completely separate from a lot of the stuff that you guys were talking about over the course of the day. But in reality, nothing in the Middle East is ever really separate from one another. It's one big, dirty, nasty, beautiful mess. So let's try to unpack this particular part of that mess as best we can. The reality of this situation here is that there's absolutely no way to cover the Iran nuclear deal in the amount of time that I've been allotted. It would take an entire panel, an entire conference just to discuss this one particular issue. That's actually kind of sad. But the saving grace is that I'm going to give you what I think are the three most important and three most digestible bits related to this expansive topic. And then I'm hoping that once we get to the Q&A portion, you can ask questions, and myself and my two colleagues will do our best to answer whatever questions you guys have. We're operating on the elementary school premise of no such thing as a stupid question. So why is this deal important? Gareth calls it a manufactured crisis. The Iranian foreign minister calls it an unnecessary crisis. I think President Obama is just relieved that he's one step closer to resolving this crisis. But the reality of the situation is we're talking about what could potentially be the most dangerous weapons known to man existing inside of Iran in the eyes of some countries. In the eyes of other countries, Iran, including Iran itself, they've never had the aspirations to have these weapons. The reality is probably somewhere in between, but rather than talk about the past, I want to talk about what's going on now and what lies ahead, because I think that's the most interesting thing, and that's what's most pertinent to hopefully securing a peaceful future. So, why is the Iran nuclear deal important? I think it's important. Well, you could ask 10 different people, they'll tell you 10 different things. I think it's important because the reality of the situation is we are talking about an issue of war and peace. And ladies and gentlemen, it is that simple. It is an issue of war and peace. The reason why it's an issue of war and peace is because, in my view, there's only two ways to solve international problems in the world. You have war and you have diplomacy. Now, the word solve here is a loosely defined term, but war or diplomacy, that's what you have. You have two options, right? Everything that happens between war and diplomacy, whether it's sanctions or secret assassinations or cyber warfare, and these are all things that happen to Iran's nuclear program, whether from the United States or allies like Israel or other countries as well. These are all stalling tactics that kick the can down the road and delays the inevitable choice between these two options, war and diplomacy. The dirty little secret that they don't tell you is that everything that happens before diplomacy, including war, is for leverage, to try to stack up as many bargaining chips as you can possibly get, because inevitably, every conflict ends with a negotiation, including war. Let me give you an example. Iraq War starts in 2003. Before George W. Bush leaves the White House, he negotiates what's called a Status of Forces Agreement with the Iraqi government that was part of the withdrawal plan that was set for the end of December 2011. President Obama comes into office, and for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into here, he decides that he might like to extend our troop presence in Iraq beyond the withdrawal date that was set by the Bush administration, December 31, 2011. As we start to negotiate with the Iraqis, the government that would not exist if it wasn't for us going in and invading the country and bombing it in 2003. As we are negotiating with this government, they say, we don't mind if your troops stay, but we're not going to give your troops immunity. Now, America does not send its troops anywhere unless American troops have immunity from prosecution under the law of that country. That was the Iraqis' way of basically saying, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Okay? So, how did that war end? It ended with a negotiation, and it ended with a negotiation, in my view, that didn't go that well for the United States, all things considered. So, fast forward to the Iran issue here, and we have successive administrations that, in my view, predate the Bush administration when this issue really came to the forefront of every newspaper headline in the world. They're trying to figure out how to deal with this Iran issue. And then when the nuclear file was put at the forefront of the Iran issue, because let's not forget, before Iran's nuclear program was ever reconstituted, before it ever became front-page news, Iran was front-page news because of the hostage crisis and because of a variety of other issues, from terrorism to God knows what else, that we as the United States, and the United States government more specifically, said we find this to be objectionable behavior, right? And then the nuclear program, because we are talking about what are conceivably the world's most dangerous weapons, catapulted it to a higher level. And then for reasons that Gareth outlined and a whole other variety of reasons, it became an even more tangible issue for not just the average American, but especially the DC establishment and folks inside of Washington, DC. So this is why I think it's become an important issue. It's this idea of war versus peace. And if we don't use the diplomatic track to try and resolve this issue peacefully, then the only option that exists is war. It's not a very popular option amongst the American people, or people in other Western countries for that matter. And that is why I think President Obama deserves credit in his second term for being courageous and taking steps that none of his predecessors really had the wherewithal or the courage to take, in my view, in my assessment. So that's one, okay? War versus peace. At least right now, it looks like the United States of America has chosen peace over war. 2 thumbs up, that's a very good thing. So what actually happened in Switzerland and what's been happening in these negotiations over the past 18 months? I've had the good fortune, or depending on who you talk to, the burden of attending almost every round of these negotiations to cover them, to meet with the negotiators, speak with journalists on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. I consider it to be the good fortune because I think what has happened over the past 18 months more generally, and in Lausanne, Switzerland more specifically, I consider this to be historic. And I think it's historic for 2 reasons. One, you would be hard-pressed to name another agreement of any kind, whether it's a framework agreement, a finalized deal, or anything in between, that was negotiated by the US and Iran, irrespective of whether other countries were party to it. You'd be hard-pressed to find another agreement that was negotiated between these 2 countries that proved to be ultimately successful. You might find 1 or 2 here or there, but certainly nothing of this magnitude. So 2 countries that would call one another enemies for over 3 decades were able to sit down at the negotiating table and have a civilized conversation. And you could probably count the number of times that's happened over the past 3 decades on one hand. So for that reason alone, I find it to be historic. But I think it's even more historic because of the actual tangible things that both sides are getting in this agreement. The compromises that were made are far more reaching than I thought that they would be at this stage of the negotiations, and I think set us up for a successful future going forward to ensure that Iran's nuclear program is verifiably peaceful and that we avoid another war of choice in the Middle East. What stands out to me about what we, as the United States and our allies in the P5+1, or permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, what we're tangibly getting from this, we're getting the most intrusive inspections regime of any nuclear program in the world. Iran is going to be signing what's called the Additional Protocol, which is essentially assuring verification of a higher degree than what Iran currently allows the IAEA to have. I'm summarizing here because I don't want to go into all the various details of the Additional Protocol and bore you with them, but it's a very good thing. More inspections and more access to the various aspects of Iran's nuclear program, very good thing. Iran is also agreeing to additional transparency measures beyond the Additional Protocol for the life of its program. Meaning that if you hear people go out into the media and say, well, this deal is only good for 10 to 15 years, and then there's a sunset clause, and all the concessions that Iran's giving is going away, it's nonsense. When this deal is done, Iran's nuclear program will continue to be the most heavily inspected nuclear program in the world, period, full stop. Also, after this deal is signed, if in fact it's signed, I want to acknowledge that it's not a foregone conclusion, but I am beyond cautiously optimistic at this point. Now I would just call myself optimistic. The IAEA will be spending more money per year of its budget on Iran than any other country. If I'm not mistaken, and somebody in this room I'm sure can correct me if I'm wrong, I think only the South Korean program or the Japanese program, either or, gets more money allocated towards inspections and things of that nature from the IAEA than Iran's program. That will change. Iran will be the most heavily inspected, and it will have the most resources directed towards it. This is very, very good, because the essence of this is that every aspect of the supply chain in Iran's nuclear program is going to be monitored, inspected, and verified. In layman's terms, that means we're going to know what Iran is doing every step of the way. Another perk is that the majority of Iran's enrichment, actually all of Iran's enrichment, let's be honest, is going to be happening in one facility with slightly over 5,000 first-generation centrifuges, technology that's over 30 years old. So, to a certain extent, a very large aspect of Iran's nuclear program is going to be essentially frozen in time. So even if they're able to make advancements on the research and development of various technical aspects of their program, they're not going to be able to go and test it in the real world. Doing things in labs and doing things in the real world and testing it for real-world viability and functionality are 2 very different things, right? So Iranian scientists will continue to be employed and will be able to continue making progress on what they consider to be important aspects of research and development of their nuclear program, but the real-world application of Iran's scientific advancement is not going to be actually operationalized in ways that presents a proliferation threat to the United States and its allies in the world. This is a very good thing. Also, 2 of Iran's nuclear facilities, the fundamental infrastructure of them are going to be changed. what was going to be a plutonium facility is essentially having the heart taken out of it, and it's going to be reconfigured completely, 2 thumbs up. And then Iran's underground facility called Fordow will be allowed to have 1,000 centrifuges to continue spinning, but they're not going to be spinning uranium. And you have the Energy Secretary of the United States, Ernest Moniz, who's a nuclear physicist, MIT trained, going on television and saying because Iran has 1,000 centrifuges in this facility that's not spinning uranium anymore, this reduces the proliferation threat, if not outright eliminates it. So again, tangible compromises that were achieved in this framework agreement dramatically improve our ability to verify that Iran's program remains peaceful. This is a very, very good thing. Obviously, we have given concessions as well when it comes to sanctions relief and number of centrifuges, even though the number of centrifuges isn't the only, or by any case of the imagination, the most pertinent aspect of Iran's nuclear program. But I want to point out to you here what the United States is getting, because we have a propensity in the American media to point out what America is giving. And I think that what we are getting out of this deal is absolutely tremendous. It's more than I thought we would get. It's more than what most people in Washington, D.C. thought would be agreed to at this point in time. And overwhelmingly, this is a good thing for security. Now, the last bit that I want to talk about is if, in fact, this deal proves to be successful, which I am optimistic that it will be, why is this a good thing for regional security? The Middle East is on fire. I think Iran is really the only country in the region that I could think of right now that isn't actively fighting a war. And you could even say that they are because of what they're doing in Syria. So really, at the end of the day, you have every Middle Eastern country fighting a war in some way, shape, or form. That's not really a good thing. So if this crisis over Iran's nuclear program can be solved, and if it can be taken off of the ledger, taken off of the balance sheet, what that provides in terms of opportunities is unprecedented. It provides an opportunity for Iran and the United States to use the nuclear agreement as a foundation to have conversations about regional security issues from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to Yemen. If you can name a regional security problem in the Middle East, chances are Iran and the United States have not been talking about it in any substantial way for at least a decade, if not longer. And if you talk to political officials in Tehran, you talk to political officials in Washington, they tell you either we don't want to talk about it, this is the minority of people, or the majority of people say we'd like to talk about it, but this nuclear issue is the 8,000-pound gorilla in the room. And it's preventing us from having the political space that's necessary to address these issues. I'm of the opinion that it frees up space in Tehran and in Washington to have a conversation that frankly is long overdue about A, whether or not our interests overlap tactically or strategically. I'm of the opinion that they do in more than one area, but not every single area in the Middle East. And if Iran is brought into these conversations, it could help find political solutions to problems that frankly haven't been able to be solved because Iran hasn't been at the table. Ladies and gentlemen, durable solutions to any major conflict require the buy-in of every country with the capacity to wreck the solution. If Iran has the capacity to wreck a political solution in Syria, or with regards to Israel-Palestine, or in Yemen, or Iraq, then they have to be brought to the table and engaged if, in fact, you're trying to find a political solution. We've been trying for over 2 decades, if not longer, to work around Iran, to isolate Iran, to prevent it from being at the table. It hasn't worked. And here's another point where I give the Obama administration credit. They realize that this is, in fact, the case, and I am of the opinion that they're willing to test the proposition of having these conversations with the Iranians in an effort to try and build a better future in the Middle East and solve problems peacefully rather than dropping bombs and firing bullets. The last thing that I'll say, because this little timer here says that I have 2.5 minutes, is that there are spoilers that are trying to get in the way. Naturally, we have a hostile Congress to really anything that President Obama is trying to accomplish, foreign or domestic policy, and they're going to be pushing hard to try and torpedo the gains that were made in Switzerland and prevent either a final deal from being signed or to prevent the United States from fulfilling whatever obligations it signs on to in any final deal. That includes AIPAC, that includes the Israeli government, that includes the Saudis, that includes Gulf Cooperation Council countries. But to the Obama administration's credit, again, they are reaching out to each of these actors and trying really hard to prevent them from doing so. Some might even say they're fighting to protect the political investment that they've made, that the vast majority of Americans support them making. So in that sense, we do have a fight on our hands. But this is a fight that I think the president is willing to fight demonstrably. This is something that the president is making an investment in now in ways that he certainly did not during the first term of his presidency. And I think that while there is still risk involved, the president and the White House have a good strategy in front of them, and it is a higher likelihood that they'll win than they will lose. But I want to emphasize to you that creating the political space that's necessary for the White House to do the kinds of things that I think everybody in this room would like the White House to do requires citizens, interest groups, you name it, across the board to be active and to create the political space for them. It's not the White House's job to create the political space for you and I. It is the job of interested citizens, interest groups, think tanks, you name it, to create the political space for the White House. If people like you and I lead, I think you have a willingness in the White House to follow. Let that be a message, if nothing else, that resonates with you going forward, not just on the Iran issue, but frankly, any other issue. Because politicians are only as brave as constituencies who are willing to support them in their next election. So let me stop there. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it.
In 18 minutes, that's about as strong as a case as you can make for the nuclear talks. Coming up next, we will turn to Paul Pillar, who is a non-resident senior fellow of the Center for Security Studies in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. In 2005, he retired from a 28-year career in the U.S. intelligence community, in which his last position was the National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia. He will discuss AIPAC and Netanyahu's objectives and the American interest.
Well, good afternoon, and for those of you who have been sitting all day, to the very last speaker of the very last panel, congratulations. The campaign to kill an agreement to restrict Iran's nuclear program has certainly been one of the biggest efforts by the Israeli government and its lobby here in the United States to influence U.S. policy. Certainly the biggest on any issue that does not relate specifically to the U.S.-Israeli relations or matters on which Israel is directly involved, like the Palestinian problem. The nature and purpose of the campaign are worthy of attention, I think, for at least two reasons. One is the importance of the agreement itself, for all the reasons that Reza just outlined. It behooves us to understand why such an agreement, which is so much in U.S. interests, is being opposed. And some of the reasons are to be found, as Reza hinted, in domestic U.S. politics right here. That is to say, people in Congress and elsewhere who want to deny Barack Obama any kind of achievement, either foreign or domestic. But it's obvious that the most energetic and persistent agitation against the agreement has come from the current government of Israel, and thus also from that government's lobby here in Washington. The other reason for studying the basis for the anti-agreement campaign is to observe what that demonstrates more broadly about Israeli motivations and intentions as they relate to U.S. interests. The starting point for understanding those motivations is to ask why, if an Iranian nuclear weapon is as fearsome a prospect as it is said to be, that the Israeli government has been opposing rather than supporting an agreement whose very purpose is to place severe restrictions on the Iranian nuclear program, to subject it to an unprecedented degree of intrusive international inspection, and to keep it peaceful. The alternative to this laboriously negotiated agreement, after all, would be no agreement at all, which would mean Iran would not be subject to any special restrictions on its nuclear program, none of the special intrusive inspections that Reza described, nothing beyond the general obligations it would have as a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If an Iranian nuke is the worry, in other words, then sabotaging the negotiations and opposing the agreement that emerges from them simply makes no sense. Now, we've heard, of course, including from the Israeli Prime Minister, the notion of getting a better deal. But let's give the Prime Minister credit to be smart enough to realize that there's not going to be a better deal than what is emerging from the current negotiations. Once all the details are laboriously hammered out over these next 2.5 months, the negotiations will have been going on for the better part of 2 years, consuming enormous time and attention of our Secretary of State, other foreign ministers, other senior officials, and with the Obama administration taking very firm stands on matters such as uranium enrichment capabilities. The deal that emerges will be the best one that can be gotten, and Mr. Netanyahu knows that. Besides, we've already seen from past experience what happens when the United States turns away from a possible agreement with Iran, turns the sanction screws tighter, and hopes for some kind of Iranian capitulation and crying uncle. The Iranians' response has instead been to expand and advance their nuclear program, which has been the basic story over the last 10 to 15 years. We might also note that Mr. Netanyahu's track record of moving the goalposts on this subject gives us a strong basis for concluding that he would not support any agreement with Iran, no matter what the terms. There is, to be sure, genuine concern and even fear among many sincere Israelis about a possible Iranian nuclear weapon, notwithstanding the strategic fact of Israel having the wherewithal to destroy the Islamic Republic of Iran in retaliation if Iran ever really did try, with what would still be far lesser capabilities than Israel's, to inflict lethal harm on Israel. But such fear is what has led a politician such as Mr. Netanyahu to develop a political strategy largely centered on exploiting that fear. And of course, when you exploit a fear, it exacerbates it even more. But even allowing for a large emotive element in how ordinary Israelis think and feel about this subject, it still makes no sense to oppose negotiation of an agreement explicitly designed to assure that the Iranian program stays peaceful. The reasons for the Israeli government's opposition to the negotiations and to the agreement have to be found elsewhere. Finding those reasons requires thinking more broadly about some of the follow-on political and diplomatic effects of the United States and its P5+1 negotiating partners striking a nuclear deal with Iran. And again, we should give the Israeli Prime Minister and other Israelis credit for being smart enough to understand those effects. A nuclear agreement represents a partial breaking of diplomatic ice, especially in U.S.-Iranian relations. Recall that only a couple of years ago, U.S. and Iranian officials weren't even talking to each other. It is a step toward Iran getting partly out of the international penalty box. It won't get entirely out of that box, and there are plenty of other issues besides the nuclear one that are reasons for sanctions that have been placed on Iran and that would remain in place. But a nuclear deal would entail partial relief from Iran's pariah status, and that has several implications of interest to Israel, and specifically to the Israeli government. One is that it will make Iran a less fettered, less restricted competitor with Israel for regional influence than it has been so far. As the second most populous country in the region, and specifically Iran, and specifically an unshackled Iran, would be, unsurprisingly, and quite legitimately, I might add, a major player in any contest for influence in the Middle East. It already is a major player, but it would be an even less restricted one than it is now. In seeking to win friends and influence people, Israel and Iran are not always appealing to the same constituencies, but sometimes they are. They're doing so in the Gulf Arab countries. One specific likely consequence of the partial unshackling of Iran will be a new rapprochement between Iran and the Gulf Arab countries, with some steps toward that end, such as some high-level visits, having already taken place in recent months, probably in anticipation of completion of the nuclear deal. Any such Arab-Iranian rapprochement makes it harder for Israel to present itself as an invaluable partner in opposing the Iranian menace on behalf of everyone else in the region. Not only will Iran be a formidable competitor for influence in terms of size and weight, it also is one that will continue to be not at all shy about criticizing Israeli policy. It will be less restrained in that respect as long as the Palestinian issue remains unresolved than the Gulf Arabs are, with their unspoken limits on castigating Israel that accompany the Gulf Arabs' close security relations with the United States. A second implication of an agreement is that Iran is a threat that is a focus of and one of the rationales for a very close U.S.-Israeli security partnership will fade somewhat. It is not, of course, the only focus and rationale for that relationship, but is one that is especially congenial to the way Israelis like to describe the lines of conflict in the Middle East. It's Iran against everybody else. Third, the completion of a complicated and important agreement between Tehran and Washington and its Western partners, and the opening that this will provide to Washington and Tehran doing worthwhile business on other matters, as Reza suggested, where their interests happen to overlap, at least partially, challenges the Israeli mantra that Israel is the only reliable and worthwhile partner that the United States has in the Middle East. Now, Israeli fears about just how much of a challenge this will be, I think, are perhaps somewhat exaggerated. Iran is not about to become a U.S. ally, and there's not even the prospect, in my judgment, of full diplomatic relations being restored between Washington and Tehran anytime soon. But the claim to being the only this or the only that is an important rationale for Israel in trying to justify the extraordinary relationship with the United States that it has enjoyed. Another of those only claims, of course, has been that Israel is the only democracy in the region. Netanyahu's government may realize that this claim, too, is wearing somewhat thin, with the Prime Minister having made explicit his determination to hold on to the occupied territories, and his biggest financial backer, Sheldon Adelson, saying, quote, "Israel won't be a democratic state, who cares," unquote. Iran, despite all of its considerable democratic deficiencies, such as the vetting of candidates by the Guardian Council and that idiosyncratic role of the supreme leader, at least does not have a large subject population with no political rights at all, as is the case, of course, with the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Bearing that in mind, I think it's fair to say that taking the greater Middle East as our framework, that the overall level of democracy in Israel and Iran these days can be considered about the same, although at the moment both are probably behind Tunisia. A fourth implication, in many ways the most important one in the eyes of the Israeli government, is that any easing of tension with Iran erodes the role of Iran as an all-purpose bête noire that serves to distract international attention from whatever Israeli leaders would rather not talk about, and from anything that the international community would rightly see as a problem largely of Israel's own making. The main subject to be distracted from, of course, is the continued Israeli hold on occupied territory and the failure to resolve the Palestinian issue. A response that the Netanyahu government has repeatedly and immediately made whenever this subject is raised is to say that the real problem in the region is Iran, and especially its nuclear program, and that's what everybody ought to be talking about instead. A successful agreement restricting that program and leading to generally better international relations with Iran will make it harder for the Israeli government to keep using that distracting device. The Israeli government is motivated by a desire to avoid all of these consequences of a nuclear agreement with Iran and of the resulting improvement in Iran's relations with the rest of the world, and especially with the United States. This motivation provides the only plausible interpretation of Israeli behavior and posturing on the Iranian nuclear issue, including the unrelenting effort to sabotage negotiations with Tehran on the subject. The motivation certainly provides a much more plausible explanation of that behavior than the simple fear of an Iranian nuke. The Israeli government's objective in this regard is not shared with the United States, and in some respects is directly contrary to U.S. interests. The United States does not have an interest in taking sides in intra-regional contests for influence in which each contestant is pursuing its own parochial, narrow interests, be they sectarian-based or anything else. The United States does have an interest in using diplomacy freely and flexibly in any way it sees fit and with any foreign interlocutor it wants to pursue its own objectives. It is contrary to U.S. interests to allow any one foreign regime to prevent the United States from doing business with any other foreign regime it may be worthwhile to do business with. And it is certainly not in U.S. interests to give Israel any further rhetorical tools to help it put off indefinitely any resolution of the Palestinian issue. Benjamin Netanyahu has devoted a lot of rhetorical effort to the idea that the United States shares interests with Israel regarding this Iranian nuclear issue. That effort has included false statements about supposed Iranian ICBMs. There's no Iranian ICBM. And silly parodies on beer commercials in which he has told us, "This bomb's for you." The U.S. and Israel do share an interest in there not being an Iranian nuclear weapon. That's what this agreement is all about, and that's why the Obama administration is pursuing it. But the Netanyahu government's behavior, in which it is attempting to torpedo an agreement that would help to ensure that there will be no such Iranian weapon, is directly contrary to U.S. interests. Thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
So we are running on borrowed time right now. So everyone does have a few question cards in front of them. So maybe if we'll just go down the line, choose your best questions, and give us your thoughts, and don't take that long.
Well, I have the good fortune of having the same question submitted by 3 different people. And I'm really happy that 3 people thought of this question, because it does, in fact, represent an extremely important point which I had wanted to talk about and ended up not doing. In fact, I prepared an entire different presentation which did deal with this question. The question is, in effect, is or isn't the nuclear issue a distraction posed by the Israelis from the Palestinian question, Palestinian issue? And in my alternative presentation, which I did write up, I make the point that not only is the Israeli demonization of Iran, which has been going on now ever since the early 1990s, since 1993, beginning with Rabin administration, Rabin government, this demonization campaign, which has been continuous ever since then, one of the themes of that demonization campaign has been that Iran is an existential threat. That's one of the primary themes, an existential threat to Israel. And that idea has been propounded by every single Israeli government since Rabin, and at least on 3 occasions, two of which are associated with Mr. Netanyahu, there is no question that this argument was in large part to indeed distract attention from or to promote a policy toward the Palestinian issue. If you go back to the Rabin government, he actually created the idea of the existential threat to Israel from Iran in order to justify his policy of negotiations with the PLO beginning in 1993. And one of the interesting things that I've learned about Rabin's policy is that he originally started talking about nuclear weapons, the threat of nuclear weapons in the Middle East after he was elected in mid-1992, but he talked about Arab regimes, particularly, of course, thinking of Iraq. He didn't talk about Iran. It was not until he actually met with Bill Clinton in late 1992, during Clinton's presidential campaign, when Clinton apparently voiced the very, very hard line toward Iran, which he believed would be popular with funders who he was appealing to in the United States as the pro-Israel candidate. And it was only after Clinton was elected that Rabin started talking about the threat, an existential threat from Iran. And so the point being that there's a reciprocal relationship here between the Israeli use of the threat from Iran, the existential threat from Iran politically, and their enablers in the United States. In this case, Clinton wanting to run as the pro-Israel candidate, again, in order, presumably, although I can't document this, to make sure that he had very strong support from funders as well as getting the Jewish vote. But the point about Netanyahu is that on two occasions, he used the existential threat from Iran in order to ward off pressure from the United States to change his policy to become more forthcoming with regard to the Oslo process, the peace process. He started doing that in 1997, very explicitly, started talking about the existential threat precisely when he needed to prevent the Clinton administration from putting pressure on him or soften any diplomatic pressure from the Clinton administration to carry out the agreements that had been already reached by the Israeli government with the Palestinians. So there's no question that that has been a fundamental policy of Israel, to use the Iranian threat, supposed Iranian threat, as a way of avoiding, another justification for, or a way of avoiding the serious negotiations with and accommodating the rights of the Palestinians. He did it again in 2012, quite explicitly, when he started talking about Hamas equals Iran. It was a way of making his domestic problems with the Palestinians an issue of the threat from Iran, which, of course, by that time, as I talked about earlier, was a major success that Israel had been able to achieve politically and diplomatically to create this idea of Iran as a nuclear threat.
Okay, we can, I have a couple of questions that I'm just going to fly through here very quickly. Fortunately, sometimes you get duplicates, as Gareth pointed out. So we'll start with the duplicate question. Today's Washington Post indicates that Iran will not agree to or sign a deal unless all sanctions are lifted. What's the prospect of lifting? What's the prospect of a final deal with Iran, given Khamenei's denunciation today on the front page of the Washington Post? I think there's an unfortunate propensity to take what the Supreme Leader says word for word at face value. I think like any politician that gives a speech, you kind of have to delve in there and connect the dots in terms of what he's saying with what's actually happening in the world. In the exact same speech, he said that if we resolve the nuclear issue, it could in fact allow for conversations with the United States on regional security issues, which is something that a lot of people in this town said he would never approve. So I do think that he came out and said all sanctions should be lifted immediately. But I don't think that's his actual position. I think there is a bit of posturing, and I think that there is a bit of spin going on. And I think the Iranians realize that it is not possible for American sanctions to be lifted upon signature of a nuclear deal. Congress isn't going to do that. So I think that there's going to be a mutually acceptable process that's put into place where it'll be step by step, it'll be based on reciprocity, and it will be decided in advance the steps that the P5+1 and Iran will take at the same time, you know, tit for tat, who gets what when, that will all be sorted out in due course. Don't get me wrong, there will be a lot of haggling over this particular point between now and the end of June, when a final deal is supposed to get done. There'll be a lot of brinkmanship, but I don't think that it's going to be an insurmountable obstacle by any stretch of the imagination. Because if nothing else, it's important to remember that every single compromise, concession, call it what you will, that the Iranians have made up to this point in these negotiations was approved in advance by the Supreme Leader. The Iranian negotiators are not freelancing. They're running everything by the Supreme Leader, and Foreign Minister Javad Zarif is the Supreme Leader's personal rep at these negotiations. So I think we're in good shape when it comes to that particular point. Next question, any chance that major powers will demand the same monitoring controls for Israeli nuclear industry? Double standards is a major problem. No, no, that's unfortunately not going to happen. Not that I don't want it to happen. I think it would be great if it happened. I'm just being realistic. Unfortunately, I don't think we're gonna see that anytime soon. But it should happen, in my humble opinion. Next question, you said that nothing in the Middle East is separate despite nearly 7 decades of suffering human rights violations. Palestine was never able to get the U.S. to stand up to Israel. Why do you think the U.S. has been unwilling to talk to, has been more willing, excuse me, to talk to and negotiate with Iran? I think it became an issue of war and peace as it relates to Iran, and a cycle of mutual escalation where, you know, sanctions, cyber warfare, secret assassinations on our side, and then Iranian bombing campaigns against Israelis around the world, systematically advancing the technical aspects of their nuclear program, 20,000 centrifuges from over the past 10 to 15 years. Both sides were running out of escalatory options that were short of what would essentially be a tripwire to war. So it was kind of like those old James Dean movies where the two cars are driving towards the end of the cliff, playing a game of chicken to see who will pump on the brakes first. Fortunately, they both hit the brakes at the same time. And that's luck. I don't even believe in luck. I think luck is for losers. But frankly, we got lucky, okay? This was not a strategic decision on the part of the United States or the Iranians. It was just cooler heads prevailed. And that doesn't happen often when we're talking about our world more generally or the Middle East more specifically, which is why I'm calling it blind luck. As it pertains to mistreatment of Palestinians and America's unwillingness to stand up to Israel, I think it was Harry Truman that once said that he compared the amount of Zionists that he has as constituents versus the lack of Arabs that he has as constituents. I don't remember the exact quote, but the reality of the situation is that domestic political constraints in the United States have a propensity to dictate the positions that a lot of our elected officials take on this one very emotionally and politically charged issue. Love it or hate it, Jewish Americans are extremely well organized politically in the United States of America, and until we have equally organized minority groups that perhaps have a difference of opinion on how these policies should play out as it pertains to the United States involvement, I just don't see a viable way for this to shift. But the fact that you're all here right now, I think, speaks volumes to the fact that it is in fact possible. The last thing that I would say as it relates to these questions, will the U.S. accept a deal with Iran unless all sanctions end? What about inspections of military installation? I think I covered the sanctions bit. They'll sort out a mutually acceptable way to get the sanctions terminated and then allow for the constraints on Iranian programs in a reciprocal manner. You don't get this far in the process to let it blow up over minutia. And it's not to say that the minutia is important, because the devil is definitely in the details, but I just don't think it blows up at this point. I think it's kind of like the banks in 2008. It's too big to fail. Inspections of military installations. Depends on what the military installation is. The International Atomic Energy Agency has had access to some military sites in the past, and if there is just cause to visit military sites in the future, I don't think that there will be a problem on the part of the Iranian end to allow those visits. But what I don't think the Iranians will agree to is allowing the IAEA to say, hey, you have a military site, we want to visit it. And the Iranians say, why? And then the IAEA says, because. I don't think that's going to happen. So I'd like to think that there's a gray area, or a middle ground, if you will, that the two sides can agree on. And in fact, I think that they actually will end up agreeing on a middle ground. Because again, the amount of compromises and concessions that both sides have made at this point are so massive that to backtrack and to let it fall apart now would be a failure of epic proportions.
All of the questions I were given are basically on the same topic, and to quote one of the cards. Why does no one bring up, one, Israel's nuclear program, two, the fact that Israel has not been inspected by the IAEA, and three, that Israel has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? The U.S. government, as a matter of policy, has never pronounced on this topic. I will follow the prescribed rules and refer to Israel's widely suspected nuclear weapons arsenal. If the writings of Avner Cohen, who is the foremost historian of Israel's widely suspected nuclear weapons program, he's written a couple of books on the subject, has, among others, described the origins of this. Goes back to the time of Richard Nixon and Golda Meir in the earliest phases of Israel's widely suspected program, in which the basic deal that was struck was that the U.S. government would not make a stink about the program as long as the Israelis did not publicly acknowledge it and thus make it a huge foreign policy problem for the Nixon administration. And that's been continued to be the policy through several administrations, and I think just through longevity and the fact that it has gone through several Republican and Democratic administrations. For the U.S. to depart from that policy would be seen as a huge step. It would be seen as, by would-be supporters of Israel in this country, as a, I mean, of the ilk that we're talking about in this conference, a big blow against Israel and a huge compromise to the special relationship. You certainly won't get any argument from me that it would be very wise to take that step. And indeed, Avner Cohen, he had an article in Foreign Affairs a while back, and other scholars have made this point, that from Israel's own standpoint, it would make sense to bring their widely suspected program out of the closet. Among other things, it would enable more open and worthwhile talks between U.S. and Israeli officials about security cooperation, that really matters, that sort of thing. But like Reza, I don't expect this is going to happen anytime soon. I would not rule it out entirely if over the next 2 years, in response to Israeli government continued attempts to do everything it can to sabotage and defeat the nuclear agreement, if the Obama administration in its closing months really wanted to play hardball, this is one thing they could have on their list of options. To finally change the policy that Nixon set over 40 years ago. But again, I'm not going to hold my breath.
Alrighty, so this has been an exciting panel and a good way to end our day today. If everyone could just remain seated for a few seconds. Delinda Hanley and Grant Smith have some final thoughts.
We've got a half-hour recap. No. We just wanted to thank everybody, myself on part of IRMEP. Please come and visit our website and sign up for our email list, and we hope that you fill out the survey, which is coming your way probably next week.
Thank you, and we really thank you for joining us as we examined the knot that binds or even strangles the United States and Israel. Let's continue to work together to untie this knot, improve our nation's policies, and align them more with American core values. And I really want to give a shout out to Grant, who has been working, his whole family has been working this for months. No one could do a conference without this man, and keep your eye on the Institute for Research in Middle East Policy.
Thanks, everybody.